First of all, just a little bit of background. I'm a Scottish Gypsy Traveller. I'm also a teacher of English and Gaelic, although it's not been used much lately, and I've got further training in media studies, so that's my general background. However, for the last 14 years I've been basically involved with Gypsy Traveller politics, you could say. I'm very much heavily involved with the rights of Gypsy Travellers. So, what I'm going to talk about today is a landmark legal ruling that I was very heavily involved with in 2008, and the presentation I'm going to give you is No Justice, Tinker, Help Thyself. For those of you who don't know what tinker means, tinker is actually a term that was ascribed to Gypsy Travellers at the turn of the 19th, 20th century in Scotland. And it's now come to be used in a pejorative sense, you know, like pikey in England, for instance. Just let's get straight into it anyway. To begin with, the background to this historic legal rule in the case of Ken MacLennan v Gypsy Traveller Education Initiative project. Ironically, it was a so-called Gypsy Traveller project which sacked someone for helping Gypsy Travellers. My involvement was that I was brought up in a tinker experiment in Bobbin Mill, Pitlochry. It was a racial experiment site, and there were many of them throughout the UK, but most especially in Scotland. The idea of it was to rid society of tinkers, making them useful to the wider society by integrating them, and so ridding society of a stain upon the thinking conscience, and that's a direct quote. This is me growing up in Bobbin Mill. I'll just turn to it as a 3-year-old and a teenager. There. First of all, as a toddler, a ferocious one, and as a teenager. And the significance of this is that by the time the second photo was taken, I was excelling academically at school, and it was impressed upon me by teachers that I would go to university, get good qualifications, and a good job would follow, hence a certain degree of economic prosperity. Okay? And for a while that did happen. I actually was the first in my teacher training year to get a full-time job. However, I didn't declare, there was no ethnic minority boxes on forms, I didn't declare that I was a Gypsy Traveller. And although McPhee is synonymous with Gypsy Travellers in Scotland, it's a name that people associate, particularly in the Highlands of Scotland, with Gypsy Travellers. They didn't really think I was a Gypsy Traveller because I didn't fit the photo fit, stereotyped image that people had in their head of thick, curly, dark hair, swarthy skin, etc. This was their idea of a gypsy, something a bit like Heathcliff, you know, that threw dogs over their shoulders. So it was quite easy for me to sort of, you know, slide in stealthily into the teaching environment to begin with. However, I moved to another school, and a neighbour from the experiment site just down the road came in, and he'd already declared that he was a Gypsy Traveller. He was the one that got me involved with this rights campaign, as it were. And because we were talking away, we were overheard speaking in camp, and that was it. I was basically what you call outed. So from there on, the position became untenable, and I couldn't get a transfer because I was the only Gaelic teacher in the region. And I decided to retrain in media, and to get into that I had to do it through the medium of Gaelic. Now, what was important was that whilst training with the media I did a year of law, and it wasn't that it was at a huge standard, but I did actually learn how to research a case, research case law, you know, plan your argument, research your evidence, your literature review, identify witnesses, etc. And this was to prove useful to me later on when I was working as an activist, as was the training I got in Strasbourg with human rights. I did through MRGI. That proved quite useful later on. Okay. When I returned to the home area, I worked as a field worker. I actually got a paid job, and that was through a Gypsy Traveller organisation that I'd helped to set up in the early 90s. And some years later I came back and I got a field worker's post in my local area. But following that I got no end of trouble when that post came to an end. Various wrangles with housing, with benefits being stopped for no reason, all sorts of things. And I never worked again in a professional capacity, certainly not as a Gaelic teacher. until very recently, last year, there was a documentary made about Bobbin Mill, and it asked a lot of questions as to why, when there's a dearth of Gaelic teachers in Scotland, they couldn't get any work, and they were needing one in the local area. So I actually got 3 months' work at 10 hours a week, because there wasn't another soul in the area who could put the children through their standard grade exams, but I've had nothing since. So it was really just a bit of tokenism because the pressure was on. Okay, so the effects of this really was that I became unemployable. Most of the work I've done as an activist has been voluntary. It still is voluntary. I'm currently the Secretary of the Scottish Gypsy Traveller Law Reform Coalition. And from there on, I've had to do manual work like planting trees, you know, even posting for planting trees with a hammer, gathering acorns, which, believe me, is back-breaking. And the last time I did it, I ended up on my knees with one hand. And brushwood, which is just dragging trees that have been cut up hills and packing them up. And that's been the sum total of the use of my academic qualifications since I started doing this type of work. So in 2007, Mr MacLennan was sacked by the Gypsy Traveller Education Initiative project. And I must stress that although it was called Gypsy Traveller Information Project, the management of it were all non-Gypsy travellers. There were only 2 on that panel who were Gypsy travellers, and I don't know how much say they actually had. This is Ken MacLennan here with another friend, Doreen McIntyre, at the Scottish Green Party, where we put a stand up all about what was happening to Scottish Gypsy travellers as part of the Scottish Gypsy Traveller Law Reform Coalition. To put you in the picture about Ken, he was an experienced and practised senior social worker. And he'd actually worked at corporate level in local authority, which means planning the service across the region. He'd worked on impact assessments with the Scottish Executive Race Equality Schemes. He was very high up in his job. But at the age of 56, he decided to go for a wind down, and he took a job which he thought would be less responsibility, heading towards his pension at 60. By the age of 57, he'd been sacked just 1 year later. And this was because he was helping Gypsy travellers to make complaints under the Race Relations Act to the, first of all, Commission for Racial Equality, and then its inheritor, the Equality Human Rights Commission. Ken had been quite empathetic towards Gypsy travellers because he'd been brought up in Muirvord, Rossshire, and just below his house was a Nissen hut like the one I was raised in, and it was another Tinker experiment site. But he didn't know that until he came into contact with us. He just thought it was poor accommodation that they'd somehow accessed and decided to live in. When he was sacked, this was a tremendous shock to the system because he'd been someone who'd been in very responsible positions with local authorities and had the ear of the Scottish Executive at that point. So he couldn't quite take it in. So in retrospect, when he thought about it, he realised he'd had verbal warnings about making complaints to the Commission for Racial Equality, and really it was all down to the fact that the project, to my mind, was funded by Scottish Government, Scottish Central Government, local authorities, and to a certain extent the Commission for Racial Equality, later the Equality Human Rights Commission. And basically they were saying, we'll withdraw the funding will be withdrawn if you don't stop making these complaints about local authorities and their dereliction of duty towards this particular client group. So if Ken was to take successfully help a Gypsy traveller take a case to court, this would have been a first and would have been greatly upset the status quo in Scotland, whereby the Commission for Racial Equality had, for instance, received numerous complaints from Gypsy travellers as the government-appointed regulatory body for racial complaints, but had never actually taken a single case to court in all of its 36 years. And it had only taken one to tribunal, and that was my one, and that was some going to get that into tribunal. And I wish I'd done it myself in the end. The grounds, we lost the tribunal, that one I took, on the grounds that no one accepted that I was an ethnic minority because I didn't have visual, I didn't visibly look like an ethnic minority, so therefore no one could have known, even though I'd been sitting on their liaison group for 5 years at the time. Ken MacLennan, therefore, would be on a collision course with the government if he were to go ahead and get a case into court with a gypsy traveller. And so this project had to reel him in, and that's what they did in spectacular fashion. He was on friendly terms with Seamus and contacted him and asked him, could you help? I don't know where to go from here because I can't really take a case to tribunal for constructive dismissal. I haven't been a full year in post. I sacked him 1 week before his year's contract would have been up, you see, so therefore legally hadn't a footing to stand on. So Seamus spoke to me because I'd been involved in 2 or 3 tribunals plus benefits tribunals for myself and other people which I'd won. So he said, what can he do? And I said, well, what he has to do is he's been victimised for doing a protected deed under the Race Relations Act. So he has to look at section 2(1)(d) of the Race Relations Act, which is basically victimisation. So this is what he decided to do. He decided to go down that route of section 2(1)(d) of the Race Relations Act 1976 to claim unfair dismissal. And at a pre-hearing, however, went the wrong way. At the pre-hearing, the project, the other side, the appellants, they decided to claim that Gypsy Travellers were not an ethnic minority, and this became a key issue, that we did not meet the criteria of ethnic minority. And this was always a reason why lawyers would say, oh, it's difficult to take a case for Gypsy Travellers because it's an airy-fairy area, it's a bit grey whether they're actually an ethnic minority or not. So what actually happened was they called for a pre-hearing, and the pre-hearing decided that we weren't an ethnic minority. And a lot was written about that. Okay. His claim, therefore, to go forward to tribunal, he had to, it would actually revolve around the issue of whether or not we constituted an ethnic minority. So he had to actually prove that we were. So from here on, this particular group who had the Gypsy Traveller Education Initiative project, which had previously received funding to do research into the grounds that we were we were an ethnic minority, and had written numerous papers. We decided to appeal that, and this was one of the first articles that was published about it. It's Colin Turbot, and it says, Tribunal setback for Gypsy Travellers. Scotland's forgotten oppressed minority, the Gypsy Traveller community, have been dealt a blow with the finding of a recent employment tribunal in Aberdeen. Ken MacLennan, a non-traveller who worked for the Gypsy Traveller Education and Information Project, GTEP, was sacked last year. Ken took the GTEP to a tribunal on the basis that he had been dismissed for activities that had upset some of the funders of the project, but which was in the interests of this ethnic minority. The nub of his argument was that Gypsy Travellers were a recognised ethnic minority. The GTEP, who claimed to campaign for Gypsy Travellers, took the extraordinary step of arguing that this had never been tested in a Scottish court, and therefore they had no case to answer. In other words, their dismissal of Ken was legitimate because Gypsy Travellers are not an ethnic minority and should enjoy no special protection, unlike their fellows England, Wales and Ireland. Okay, so it goes on, and it actually quotes that they spoke to me in Seamus, and it said they asked me for an opinion, and I said this has got to be challenged and as quickly as possible. There are reasons after 13 years in supply list why I can't get a Gaelic teacher post. I know what they are, and they're based on discrimination, pure and simple, and not popular because I've spoken out and I've suffered for it. And this is what has characterised this whole case, Mr MacLennan's case, because he had spoken out and he was suffering for it. Seamus was actually in the same position because he'd been contesting the legality of charging people for living in degraded conditions since 1999, I might add, and he's still doing so. He was faced with sheriff officers and council tax demands and what have you, which he questioned since 1999. And as he stated, they want thousands of pounds from me for council tax. This is meant to be payment for services, but until now we have had none on this site, not even the basics of water and electricity. Well, we did have water, but we didn't have cold water, we didn't have hot water, and we didn't have water in the caravans. So you'll see pictures of Bobbinhill site later on. The Scottish Government took a very laissez-faire attitude, and there was a bit of inertia. basically we can't do anything about this, and the local authorities, all to do with finance and local services and local accommodation, is devolved to local authorities, and we don't get involved in that. So it's just a case of passing the buck, really. So following this decision, which ruled that his claim had no reasonable prospect of success, Ken phoned again to ask if it would help him with the appeal. And I said to him at this point, you know, I'm finding it very difficult dealing with planning issues, because I'm going into offices and being told, oh, you're no longer considered an ethnic minority, toddle off, we're not doing anything to help you. You can't invoke the Scottish Gypsy Traveller private site guidelines now if you're doing a planning appeal. So this was actually biting as soon as it came in. So I said, you actually have to appeal this, and you have to win it. This was the basic request that we put in. The grounds for review were that evidence was not presented to the tribunal at the pre-hearing on 18th December that Scottish Gypsy Travellers are an ethnic group, and that it is in the interests of justice that this evidence is considered, and without consideration of this evidence there may have been a miscarriage of justice. On a point of law, the Mandela criteria, which is used with the CRE, the regulatory body for the implementation of and adherence of the terms of the 1976 Race Relations Act and Race Relations Amendment Act 2000, as the benchmark by which to judge racial or ethnic origin, was ignored by the chairman in his final decision making. Other relevant legislation not presented at the preliminary hearing is dealt with in section B. So basically we gave them a list of legislation and case law that they should have looked to, and a list of, like a literature review that was pertinent. This was how we went about it. we made up a list for Ken, what he had to do, and we identified that, they'd used Dutton, CRE versus Dutton in 1989, in their earlier decision. So we identified Mandela and another versus Lee and others, 1983, and P. O'Leary and others versus Allied, Dominic and others, 2000. Now the significance of the first one, the Mandela one, decided that there was a set of criteria which you have to meet before you can be considered to be an ethnic minority. And if your group does not meet that, then you're a social group rather than an ethnic or racial group. The second one, P. O'Leary, Judge Goldstein actually found that Irish travellers met those criteria, and that there should be no anomalous practice, direct quote, throughout the UK. However, there was anomalous practice, particularly in Scotland. The other one I directed him to was the Tribunal, which I got the CRE to take at long last, 2003 to 4, against Perth and Kinross Council. In that particular case, I went for a Gaelic development post, and they gave it to a boy with one hire from school, no O grades, no degree, no teaching certificate, but he did have a car and he'd worked as a handyman part of the time. So he was considered to be better qualified for the post than me. This case went forward, but what was important was that Mr. O'Carroll, that was my QC, submitted that the applicant, as a Scottish Gypsy Traveller, was a member of a racial group within the meaning of Section 3 of the 1976 Act, Race Relations Act. The respondents conceded that this was so, and they did not contest that part of it at all. But I did lose it because they decided they couldn't tell that I looked like an ethnic minority. Ken then had to identify relevant academic writings, and Seamus had a veritable library in his caravan there. He couldn't find anything else but paintings and academic writings, so he pulled them out and gave them to Ken. We had to identify appropriate leading academics, so having been through the tribunal system, I already knew of Professor Judith Oakley, who'd written extensively on this, and Dr. Colin Clark, whom the CRE had commissioned to do a paper on ethnicity for my tribunal, which they did not contest. However, the Scottish Executive and the Commission for Racial Equality somehow buried that paper, and when Ken approached them to ask for it, they couldn't find it. So I managed eventually to track down Colin Clark, and he agreed to be a witness. Then we had to get Ken to organise all his material in an appropriate way, which he was quite capable of doing. He's a very intelligent person. And just make sure that he had them in a running order, that he could refer to them easily should he be unable to procure the services of a solicitor. He had to then prepare a potential list of questions that he would need to use on each witness in order to elicit from them the information relevant to the demolition of the submission by Ian Taggart of Gypsy Traveller Education Information Project contended that we were not an ethnic minority, and secondly to illustrate fully that we met the 2 essential criteria laid down by Mandler plus any of the other criteria contained therein. This is just an email, and it shows you in big bold letters which I received from Ken. Document as promised for your comments. Need them today. Email this address or phone me. Best wishes, Ken. And it was from a neighbour. I didn't know who this Doreen was, so I wasn't returning anything to him, and he was getting very jittery. I emailed him via the neighbour, and he went in and said, "This is a neighbour, it's okay." So I actually had to read it in a centre because I've got no internet. I've got no internet access on my site. Run out, phone Seamus, get Seamus's view on a couple of things, run back in, type up some stuff and send it to him, and then he had to cobble that together and get that in by the next morning at 9:30, and that was his request for a review of the original decision that we weren't an ethnic minority. This was an email to Colin Clark. Dr. Clark, hi Colin, hope this finds things a bit improved for you. I'm emailing to alert you to the fact that Ken MacLennan may have to put in an appeal soon, and your writings on the subject of Gypsy traveller ethnicity would be pivotal to the argument. We need to pick your brain nearer the time. We may need to, when the appeal needs fine-tuning. Hope this won't add to your stress levels in any way. Thinking of you and sending you a gypsy blessing. He was very ill, and he wasn't sure if he was going to make the tribunal at that point, and Ken couldn't track him down, but I had other contacts for him. As well as trying to assist Ken with the preparations for the request for the review of the earlier decision, we, the Scottish Gypsy Traveller Law Reform Coalition, which I'm the Secretary, decided that the Equality and Human Rights Commission ought to be pressurised into clarifying its position on this issue, given that all the rhetoric coming from the organisation seemed to support legal clarification of the ethnicity debate. So to that end, we actually went and demonstrated outside the Commission. Yeah, we did, it's there somewhere. Within a half hour of demonstrating, the director, who had ignored all the calls, the phone calls and emails that went to him, we'd had no response, suddenly appeared within half an hour on a bicycle coming from another meeting. And she invited us cordially into the building to discuss matters, but I had a huge crowd outside, and I said, I better stay and talk to them, the rest can go in, just to keep it going. Basically, we had another meeting with them, and the best we could get from them was that they would talk to GTEEP, which they funded, but there was no evidence that, as later claimed, that they pressurised them into not contesting the appeal, because in actual fact they did contest it, they just didn't send a lawyer, they sent written papers in. Ian Taggart. This is me, Seamus and Catherine McFarlane, who was our secretary beforehand, demonstrating outside the Commission, and we actually attracted a huge crew from the Bank of Scotland headquarters across the road, who all suddenly took their cigarette breaks and came over to talk to us. So, and we brought along, you might just see a camera there, we brought along a student crew from Stirling University, who media students. But of course the Commission didn't know who they were. They thought we had a camera crew from a TV station, and they were panicking like mad. They tried contacting the police, but there was less than 6 standing at the door, and we didn't block the door, so the police said we can't do anything about it. Everyone's chatting to them amicably, we just have to leave them. So, following on from that anyway, this is an extract of what the Tribunal found about, regarding the Equality and Human Rights Commission. The claimant had believed that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission would have provided him with representation. It had been informed that the respondents were raising the ethnicity issue. The claimant believed that the status of Scottish Gypsy Travellers was of utmost strategic importance to the Commission because of the work that the Commission for Racial Equality had been undertaking. The statements that had been made by the CRE on this matter and the encouragement the CRE had given to various parties to resolve the matter. The EHRC, however, informed the claimant on the 13th of December that it wasn't going to be representing him at the preliminary hearing as his case wasn't strategic. Grampian Racial Equality also said the same, and they would only be helping him with an RR65, which is just filling out a form asking questions, so nothing to it, you could do it yourself. The CRE in Scotland's Gypsy Traveller Strategy for the previous year 2627 sets out the actions it planned to take to counter discrimination and harassment experienced by Scottish Gypsy Travellers In particular, the strategy identified specific work relating to bringing about legislative change, clarifying the status of Scottish Gypsy Travellers under the Race Relations Act. This is what we were asking them to do here. Challenging racist reporting in the media and supporting community groups. It may be of interest to note that the EHRC wrote to the claimant on the 13th of February stating, although as previously discussed the EHRC decided your case was not strategic, it may become strategic if Tribunal makes a decision on the ethnic status of Gypsy Travellers under the Race Relations Act 1976. However, it wrote again on the 13th of March, we are again considering this matter and will contact you again in the near future. And then on the 14th of March, they considered it very briefly, I would think. I also add for clarity that the EHRC does not represent you. So attempts to obtain legal representation from the British Association of Social Workers, of which he was a member, proved fruitless because of the timescale. They ditched him about 3 weeks before the tribunal. And this is a pattern that's been going on for years. The claimant had also been unable to apply for a postponement within the time scale required because of the short notice from the EHRC. It was clear, therefore, that no help was going to be forthcoming from any of the official bodies and that legal advice from the Equality Human Rights Commission and from a top lawyer, whom Ken paid handsomely himself for an opinion in the case, was that the chances of winning this tribunal or pre-hearing were slim. Although the solicitor changed that after we won the ethnicity question. Suddenly, game on, we're on again. The EHRC stated the following in response to Ken querying why they would not help him with the case. Now, you may not be able to read that up there. I certainly can't on here, so I'll read it. I refer to your request for the Commission to consider your request for legal assistance. I've now taken instructions and respond as follows. My instructions are that your case has already been considered on 3 occasions by the Commission, most recently by the Legal Committee. On each occasion, a decision not to support has been taken. In exceptional circumstances, if new information becomes available, then a case can be reconsidered. And it goes on to say there's none. The only issue in your case which could have been considered to be strategic for the Commission was the issue of Gypsy Traveller ethnic status, the one that they declined to help with. However, as I understand, you were advised in May that the evidential and legal weaknesses with your case means that it was not the appropriate case for the Commission to argue this issue. They didn't. He's got nothing saying what the weaknesses were in this case. And even if his case was set to one side, the pre-hearing was looking at simply the issue of ethnicity. So that whether his case was weak or not when it went forward, that was up to him. But they refused to help us. It's important to contextualise this treatment with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, whereby they left Ken MacLennan without representation so close to a hearing. This appears to be the same tactic used by their predecessors, the Commission for Racial Equality. Their legal aid and assistance paper had a very fine small print which allowed for it to be removed at any time. In fact, it was so small on the bottom that if you didn't have a huge magnifying glass as big as that, you wouldn't see it. So people generally did not see it. An increasing number of Gypsy Travellers were making complaints, but the CRE, before its demise in 2007, never took a single case to court or to tribunal, and that's in 36 years, because none of them were strategic. Indeed, the CRE sat with my employment tribunal complaint in 2003-4 for 8 months. They postponed it once in that time, and then 3 weeks before the second scheduling of the hearing, I received a call from them saying that it wasn't the best use of resources and that they had decided to remove the assistance. Now, this is the same as what happened to every other single complaint that was made to them. As with Ken's case and many others, this left me with no prospect of procuring a solicitor at this late stage. I mean, with the best will in the world, you can't get a solicitor in Scotland, but to get one within 3 weeks of a case and put it together, given that people have a huge caseload anyway, it just never was going to happen. So I told them in no uncertain terms that we were not removing the assistance, and aided by a friend from the Scottish Gypsy Traveller Association at that time, I threatened to glue my hands to their door, which they shared with the BBC. My friend got a big loudspeaker and said, well, we're just going to stand here and shout up, you know. By 5 o'clock that day, the assistance was back on the list. It was back on the assistance list. And they took the case, but I'll be quite frank with you, I think they did it very half-heartedly and didn't do the best job for me, in my opinion. As a result of vigorous lobbying by the Scottish Gypsy Traveller Law Reform Coalition, both Amnesty International UK and the Association of British Social Workers have called for an official investigation into the role and work of the Equality and Human Rights Commission with regard to Scottish Gypsy Travellers. Now, to put this into perspective, what they've been doing, first of all, the Commission for Racial Equality, now the Equality and Human Rights Commission, taking cases so far and ditching them when it's so difficult to get a solicitor anyway for a civil representation in Scotland. If you're going to a tribunal claims, and they know this, based on race, are only 16% of them are successful. And of that, you know, that's 16% that actually have a solicitor working on their behalf. So to do that to Ken MacLennan was really morally indefensible, I think. So why did he continue with the appeal? Another email to Thelma Stober, which he actually sent to her from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. I have difficulty sometimes understanding how people operate sometimes. I hate injustice, and even more so when people are aware that it is happening and for whatever reason justify not doing anything about it. He goes on again about, you know, he heard about another gypsy traveller whose case was taken, made a formal complaint about discrimination to the Commission in Scotland, and guess what, it was not strategic. Where haven't I heard that one before? So basically they're looking for a perfect test case, but you know, you don't get perfect cases, and it's a hit or a miss when it goes to court if you're going to win. There's no guarantees. So it became a matter of conscience, and I think what had happened to Ken, because initially I thought he was a bit pompous and patronising, I'll be honest. He kept going on about you're not utilising the processes properly, but when it happened to him it was a different thing. It was like he'd been hit over the head with a mallet, wooden mallet. And suddenly he realised the processes weren't working. It wasn't us who couldn't utilise them. So he suddenly started, he became into the company of others like myself, Seamus, you know, Willie, who'd gone to England, different people. And he realised he was being ostracised, he'd been alienated, and he'd been economically annihilated, if you like, same as we had been. In turn, he came to further explore the whole predicament of the Scottish Gypsy Traveller community, and in actual fact I recruited him as the treasurer for our group recently, so we're working good guns there. As a result, he felt compelled to continue with this appeal because he felt, you know, he wouldn't just be letting himself down, he'd be letting the whole Gypsy Traveller community down as a whole if this was allowed to stand. He felt demoralised at times, and he felt like throwing the towel in, so we had to basically say, no, you can do this, you know, and sort of energise him to do it, get him going again. No official body was going to help him, so it really fell down to me and Seamus to help him, and that's how we started preparing that appeal. The hearing was on the 8th, 9th of September 2008. Seamus was exhibiting paintings yet again in the Moulin Kirk in Pitlochry at the History and Heritage group where we live, and he couldn't go up to Inverurie to help him fine-tune the appeal because he now had to appear and present his own case. So we'd sort of been planning for that because we were pretty sure he wouldn't get a solicitor unless he had about 30 or 50 grand in his pocket, and we knew he didn't have that unless he sold his house. Seamus spent most of Saturday night with him. They were in a tent over in a campsite because he couldn't afford B&B. He booked into a tent for the 2 nights and a big torch. And I remember him saying to him, you're thick, you should know this by now. You ought to know this off by heart. And then the next day I met him and we went through the questions for the opening statement relevant to the sections of the Mandla criteria of the 2 essential characteristics laid down by Mandla and another versus Lee and others. Lord Fraser identified those as a long shared history of which the group is conscious, thus distinguishing it from other groups, and the memory of which keeps it alive. A cultural tradition of its own, including family and social customs and manners, not necessarily associated with religious observance. There were other ones: a common language, common origin or descent from a small number of common ancestors, common literature peculiar to the group, common religion different from that of neighbouring groups or from the general community, and being a minority or being an oppressed or dominant group within a larger community. So we attended the hearings the hearing as well. After helping put it together, we turned up as community witnesses and provided precognitions. We spoke in reference to the first two essential Mandela criteria, but our testimonies differed. Seamus spoke more about language, being a qualified translator-interpreter, and he gave a language lesson in Cant to the Tribunal. He referred them to various texts, including James Hayward's Gypsy Jib, work of the late Hamish Henderson at the School of Scottish Studies, the work of the Elphinstone Institute, Aberdeen Uni. Showed them an array of family photos which illustrated traditions, making bender tents, basket making, and also examples of his paintings with which he helps to keep the memory of the long shared history alive. Dr. Colin Clark, senior lecturer at Strathclyde University, he'd been in friendly terms, we had been, and he'd written a paper. He provided this along with others, and the judge selected the two following excerpts from the papers that he provided. The origins of the Scottish Gypsy Traveller population remain disputed, but Scottish Gypsy Travellers have their roots in a Celtic and possibly pre-Celtic nomad population in Scotland. In Scotland too, the tinker has long been known before the advent of the gypsies. There has been historically some intermarriage and social trade networks with the Roma, a nomadic population that migrated from India through Egypt and through Eastern Europe, hence gypsies and Romanes to Western Europe. Objectively, we can say that contemporary Scottish Gypsy Travellers in Scotland are part of a nomadic community that has endured for centuries throughout the whole of Scotland. There has been substantial Scottish Gypsy Traveller migration from Scotland and Britain, at least the period of the main Highland clearances. He goes on from there. The next one, he says, it is clear that Scottish Gypsy Travellers have long had awareness of self-identity and of difference from the settled population in both Britain and within Scotland itself. Belonging to the category Scottish Gypsy Traveller was the defining features of Scottish Gypsy Travellers' lives. Settled people, Scaldies, Flatties and cannot become Scottish Gypsy Travellers even if they marry Scottish Gypsy Travellers or begin to lead a nomadic way of life. The memory of this history remains very much alive, now written in written form as much as the long-standing oral tradition that Scottish Gypsy Travellers possess. Okay, so these were selected as key issues. It goes on paragraph... no, I've done that. As a result of the quality of this evidence provided, including written testimonies from Professor Judith Oakley of Hull University, the judge, Nicol Hosey, concluded in relation to the first essential criteria, notwithstanding Mr Taggart taking a different view, we had no difficulty in the light of all the evidence which we heard and the supporting documentation in deciding unanimously that Scottish Gypsy Travellers satisfy this first essential characteristic. Evidence was overwhelming, so far so good. We had to satisfy the second one though, crucially. With regard to the second essential characteristic, the judgment quoted from Dr Clark's report with reference to the intermarriage between the tinker, now known as Scottish Gypsy Travellers, and 16th century gypsy migrants, so that gradually the gypsy stream broadened out and highlighted also the mention of the gypsy taboos, particularly customs of washing clothes apart from dishes or dishcloths. It continued, Roseanna McPhee gave many examples of this from her own experience of customs taboos, manners relating to marriage, child rearing, sexual matters, cleanliness and death. Seamus McPhee also spoke of gypsy traveller systems of beliefs with regard to personal habits, for example, will not wash clothes in the same basin as tea towels. Furthermore, the final summation made special mention of the fact that Seamus referred us to a report on the education of gypsy children, which was presented to the Secretary of State for Scotland in 1895, which described in detail a marriage ceremony which may reflect Eastern European migratory route. Blood was taken from small nicks in the arm and leg of the bride and groom, as these were points of strength, and it was mingled. Additionally, the couple urinated in a pail, and this was thrown on the fire. The amount of steam and smoke it produced was judged as indicative of the length of the marriage, much smoke indicating a long one. Now, a word of caution, that's a long marriage, not necessarily a long and happy marriage, so it doesn't guarantee happiness. It's just a long, drawn-out process. The significance of the points regarding rituals, such as the wedding one described, or customs and practices associated with concepts of cleanliness, served to underscore the second essential characteristic of a cultural tradition of its own, which was demanded by the criteria and led the judge to conclude in summation, in our view, the evidence was presented to us in relation to this second essential characteristic was equally convincing as the first. Of the non-essential, we went through them all, and I think the main one that kind of nailed it from the non-essential was Seamus did this exhibition sort of lesson with a whiteboard on the cant. And the Tribunal concluded at the Tribunal here, and Seamus McPhee demonstrated convincingly the derivation of Kant and its connections with Romany and therefore Sanskrit, Hindi, Wallachian, Latin, German, Gaelic and Scots. He was able to take a number of common words in Kant and trace them back to their original linguistic origins. There was no doubt in our view that Scottish Gypsy Travellers also satisfy this characteristic, i.e. their own common language. We went through all the others, myself, Seamus and Dr Colin Clark, the non-essential characteristics, and basically each one in the same way. We gave evidence and, you know, they picked out the important points from them. However, it was not only the quality and applicability of the evidence which the Tribunal took into consideration, but also the manner of delivery and the way in which we all addressed the Tribunal in their capacity as witnesses. Indeed, before examining the relevance of the evidence, the judge concluded, although there was some conflicting written opinion from Mr Taggart, which we deal with below, we were of the view that the evidence which Dr Clark gave and the opinions he expressed were both credible and reliable and were to be preferred. Roseanna and Seamus McPhee were equally impressive witnesses. Both gave their evidence in a consistent and measured way, and we were entirely satisfied that they were both credible and reliable. So this led to this landmark legal ruling, the first time ever that we had a legal forum saying, yes, you're an ethnic minority, you now are protected under the Race Relations Act, you have legal protection. Having satisfied ourselves, therefore, that the two main characteristics set out by Lord Fraser and Mandler were satisfied, and that the other non-essential characteristics were satisfied in varying degrees, we arrived at the view that Scottish Gypsy Travellers have ethnic origins with relevance in particular to section, that should be 3.1, I've done a typo there, of the 1976 Act, and that they therefore enjoy the protection of that. So this judgment was unequivocal, and it was the first time we ever got protection under the Race Relations Act, and now officially protected by race legislation generally. It was a landmark legal ruling and a historic turning point for Scottish Gypsy Travellers, but was it really? The newspapers seemed to latch on to the story. There were several articles appeared. If you go on the web, there's more than even I was aware of. And this is just two of them below. Scottish Gypsy Travellers win recognition by Colin Turbot, and Scottish Gypsies are distinct ethnic group, rules judge. Colin Turbot, Scottish Gypsy Travellers are celebrating the recent judgment of Nicol Hosey at an Aberdeen Employment Tribunal in the case of Ken MacLennan, a non-Gypsy traveller who was dismissed last year from an Aberdeen-based project. And basically just says we won that, we gave evidence and we won that. It does state that the Equality Human Rights Commission pressured the other side not to defend the position. I don't think this is correct, because they did defend it in writing, they just didn't turn up in person because it was indefensible what they were doing. They'd taken money for research to produce papers saying we were an ethnic minority, but when the heat was on they suddenly said we weren't an ethnic minority. This one was from the Herald in Scotland. Scottish Gypsies are a distinct ethnic group. Scottish Gypsies have been recognised as a distinct ethnic group in a landmark legal ruling. Scottish Gypsies have been recognised, goes on, the move means that the travelling community is now entitled to the same legal protection as other ethnic minorities as outlined by the Race Relations Act of 1976. With their newly recognised status, they can bring claims of racial discrimination to employment tribunals, which we've been trying to do anyway, after an appeals tribunal in Aberdeen overturned a previous decision to the contrary. Basically, they're saying you've now got protection, you can take cases to tribunal and court. The Scottish Government, however, they had to, there was nothing positive came from them, nothing positive from the Equality Human Rights Commission and nothing positive from the Scottish Commission for Human Rights. They didn't even issue a statement about it. The Scottish Government had to incorporate in their race statement because it has implications and ramifications for all tiers of government and public body. And they said about the recent judgment in Ken MacLennan versus GTEEP has set a precedent in this regard. The recent Employment Tribunal judgment concluded that Scottish Gypsy Travellers are a group which can be defined by reference to its ethnic origins. They finalised that, saying whether or not it will be followed by courts of higher authority is unclear. So there's a little negative barb there. This could be overturned in a higher court. But what I would say is, listen to what the judge said in the tribunal. The evidence was overwhelming. They also said that they didn't have the power to do anything about this because it was a reserved matter to Westminster. However, they could have done what the Northern Ireland Parliament did in 1997, some 14 years previously, and make a race relations amendment order. Northern Ireland asked the Westminster to make the Race Relations Northern Ireland Order 1997, which gave gypsy travellers in Ireland ethnic status and protection under that. And this refusal to do likewise from the Scottish Government came despite the fact that gypsies and Irish travellers are among the most marginalised groups in our society. The Race Relations Act, as amended by the Race Relations Amendment Act, provides a framework within which to challenge both direct and indirect discrimination against them, and its use should be considered whenever there is reason to suspect such discrimination, and that's from the Discrimination Law Association. 3 years on, though, from that, what's the impact been? Well, there hasn't succeeded in bringing either a tribunal case or a court case. There's no member of the community brought one. The reason for this was partially thrown up by Ken MacLennan's case, because there's a great deal of difficulty in which to get a solicitor. If you've got a lot of money, you might get what you call a rogue solicitor who'll go and do it anyway. But generally speaking, you can't get one. Okay, the quality organisations are never going to take a case, and looking for a lawyer is like searching for the Holy Grail, frankly. To illustrate, I was brought up in this camp that I'm going to show you. It's a Nissen hut, no hot water, no electricity, a coal fire in the living room, a sink, a toilet, and one bedroom between 9 children. My father, who was a master builder when he came out of the Navy, trained for 5 years, said, look, can we either extend this or knock it down, demolish it and put a decent thing up? And they said no, but you can put a shed in the garden for the boys. So he put a shed in the garden, some bunks. He paid rent and council tax, previously, community charge rates, a lot for this. And my mother he lived in it for 52 years. My mother lived in it since 1947 when it was first put up. There it is there, that Nissen hut. It's just that it was an old pre-war hut. In fact, it was used during the war to house prisoners at Auchterarder, prisoners of war, including Italian prisoners of war, German, Polish, a lot. And when the war finished, 1945, they decided that would do as good accommodation. Those are the caravans, that was the road. And previously to that, before they put that up, because they thought they were doing well with that, this was Bobbin Mill here. They lived in these little huts, like so. It's just like a little shed, for storing things in. And you'll see my great-grandfather making baskets there, so that was featured in a magazine in the end of the 30s. Okay. My father died in 2009. He had cancer and he couldn't get home to die in the house like he wanted. He tried to leave the hospital 2 nights before he died, put his clothes on at 12:30 at night, pulled all the tubes out and tried to walk up the road because the hospital's at the bottom of the road. This hut was visited by monitors from the Framework Convention in 2007, along with some other experiment camps that I took them to, and it was described as squalid in the report. They actually said they might expect to find this in an Eastern European state, but not in a well-off, wealthy state like Scotland. Despite having monitors and various human rights organisations, I had Claude Kahn over from the ERRC at that time. It found that it constituted a clear breach of human rights as we were living in degraded conditions. I couldn't procure the services of a solicitor, so I was told that there's been no cases for gypsy travellers to the Scottish courts. In fact, there's been virtually no human rights cases. So I asked both the UK Association of Gypsy Women and the Racial Complainant Officer Richard Pitts at Central Scotland Racial Equality Council to help me source a solicitor, but it was in vain. And this is his responses. Now that's just the first page of the list. The first one there actually wanted to take the case, Elaine Swanson, but she declined after 3 weeks citing conflict of interest. She said her board of management wouldn't let her take it and she was going to do it pro bono. Yeah, okay. The next one's saying he confirms he cannot get a solicitor, sometimes because they can't do, they don't do traveller cases, other times because they can't bring in, they just don't have enough solicitors trained specialising in discrimination. I told Colin Turbot, who did those articles, because he's a chair of Unison, it's a big union, and he's in the Socialist Party, and this is a response he got back from one solicitor who's a friend, but not in the area of law. Really pleased you might be able to help. My email avalanche has produced a trickle of 30 knockbacks. One positive said he would look at the case for 50 to 30 to 50,000 plus. Well, we just had that. So anyway, another one did a telephone interview for 7 minutes. He said if the human rights breach was ongoing that we could take it to court. And then by the time the telephone interview came around, he said that we couldn't take it to court because it was time barred. Now, this was a load of nonsense, because it wasn't long after that the Scottish Government asked Westminster to amend the Scotland Act because there was no time bar in relation to human rights cases. So that was a piece of piffle, if you like. Then, what could we do? Well, basically, we're totally excluded. So what is it that we were going to do? Was it the exclusion that we were facing from the legal process? Was it government collusion, establishment collusion, or what? The Law Society of Scotland advised me, you can take a civil case yourself. However, you cannot apply for legal aid. Therefore, you're going to be liable for all the court costs if you fail. Now, I think there's about 3% of people out of the 33% who've taken cases themselves have actually won it. So that was giving me a fighting chance. The European Convention of Human Rights, Human Rights Act 1998 UK and Scottish Human Rights Act are effectively redundant, therefore. The two solicitors that we approached were the only two that actually let us pass reception to look at the case. So it's not a case of did the case not have merit. So it's a case of what can we do? It's a case of tinker help thyself. So Seamus and I sat and went through the convention for about 3-4 weeks. We then put all our paper trail together, and then we made a complaint to Strasbourg in September 2008, and they added it to their case files. And I've now got this letter here, which I'll just read finally from it. The letter came in March 2011 saying, the court will begin examining your application very soon. Could you therefore update the court as to recent developments, improvement in the housing situation? Have you been able to get a lawyer? And basically we've just done that and we're waiting to hear if it will go forward. Now, it may be that it goes forward. If it does, there's only about 5% go forward to the upper court anyway, and only 1% of those are successful. So again, we've got a fighting chance. But we've got as good a chance as we would have had without, in a Scottish court, I think. The importance of this, the Legate report lightly underscores, it should never be forgotten that tribunals exist for users and not the other way around. And I should say this is also the case of the court, that they're not fulfilling their primary function. No matter how good tribunals may be, they do not fulfil their function unless they're accessible by the people who want to use them and unless users receive the help they need to prepare and present their cases. Furthermore, states that an unrepresented party may be disadvantaged if the other parties represent them. So what did Ken get from that? Nothing. He got his self-respect and self-esteem back, I think, but he's penniless. Well, he's not penniless now, he's getting half his house. His marriage broke down and he's living in a caravan with no electricity, just like me and Seamus have been for years. So we're all in good company together. Now he really appreciates what it's like to be a gypsy traveller in Scotland. I think he's a better person for it. I don't think it's coincidence that we've all been virtually annihilated economically, we're not employable. And I think that this disease called victimisation should be counteracted somehow, but how when you can't even take a legal case to court? There's a lot of good people out there, including gypsy travellers, and they see this, but they witness the discrimination, they witness the victimisation, but they just maintain a silence. And it's not driven by dignity, it's driven by fear. So what can you do if you're not allowed to use your skills and talents? Well, a good friend of mine who's now a writer, he has been for years, said, you've got work to do, you've got to start writing. And that's actually what we decided to do. We'd do our trilogy of victimisation and corruption in the Scottish Government and Scottish political circles and how they treat gypsy travellers. And I've got a wee bit of a head start on the boys because I've actually started doing that. I've got my first 3 chapters. I'm going to leave them here as a memento for the testimony. And with that, without much more ado, I'll just say thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad that I had this opportunity to come here. Thank you.